This is a story of a city that could no longer hold its contradictions. Pride and fear braided together, law and the lust for power, friendship turned knife-deep. It is about the moment a people's fear of one man's dominance became the spark for a chain that would consume the very thing they sought to save. At its heart are men who loved Rome differently, some through order and ambition, others through devotion to old laws, and the violent, irreversible choice they made to try to steer the Republic back to its past. Listen for the private struggles as much as the public deeds, the quiet motives that push a man to stab a friend, the cunning words that turn a mourning crowd into a raging mob, the slow arithmetic of armies and heirs that seals a nation's fate. This is not just an account of a murder, but of a republic breathing its last and the birth of something that would call itself peace. The morning was cold, and the city smelled of old stone and oil. Julius Caesar moved through Rome like a man who knew which streets bent to his will. Yet even he felt the tug of unease when senators crossed his path with lowered eyes. He had returned victorious from Gaul and masterful, beyond any rival's imagining. He had survived wars and plotted with kings, and now he stepped toward a lifetime title the old constitution had never conceived. For some, Marcus Tullius Cicero among them, the idea of one man above the law was anathema. For others like Mark Antony, the man mattered more than the office. Caesar had been a friend, a general, a patron. And in the shadow between loyalty and law stood Marcus Junius Brutus, a son of Rome's republican story, and a man Caesar had trusted like a father. Brutus's home was not grand, but it was full of books and speeches, and the whispered ideals of a city that had prided itself on shared rule. Guests would come and find him reading, thinking aloud about the old senates and the hollowing of magistracies by men who sought eternal power. He had fought against Caesar once. Later, Caesar had spared him, embraced him, favored him with offices. The favor sat in Brutus like cold iron. Gratitude nodded with dread. Gaius Cassius Longinus was the fire to Brutus's careful winter. Where Brutus hesitated, Cassius struck. He gathered men in the shadow of the theater of Pompey, Romans whose land had been taken by Caesar's veterans, aristocrats whose honor had been insulted, magistrates who had been shuffled aside. Night after night, they spoke of liberty like it was something alive, something that might yet be rescued by steel. "You know how he smiles at you, Marcus," Cassius told Brutus one evening, voice low. "You know the way his triumphal robes make him seem above the law. He will be king if no one stops him." Brutus's hand trembled on the cup he held. He saw the axis of Rome's future bending toward one man. He saw also Caesar's kindness, the private letters, the shared dinners. He thought of his ancestor, the elder Brutus who had driven out the last Tarquin king. He thought of the oath taken to keep Rome a republic. In the end, guilt for inaction felt worse than guilt for murder. They argued of timing and manner, and of what would come after. The conspirators painted a future. The knives would fall, the tyrant would die, the laws would rise like reeds again, and Rome would breathe freely. They swore to each other oaths by the gods, and laid with their hands upon the ledger of the city. No one liked the deed. Each man convinced himself he loved Rome enough to live with blood on his hands. The Senate was to meet in the Curia in the theater of Pompey, because the Curia Julia was under repair. It was a place of shadows and echoes, of marble columns that overheard confessions. On the Ides of March, Caesar, aware or unaware of certain omens, as men would later say, entered with a retinue thin for his station so as not to alarm the senators. He wore no armor, only a simple purple-bordered robe, a man leaning on the supreme confidence of victory. The conspirators gathered around him like a nervous chorus. Casca struck the first blow, and chaos spread quickly and horribly. A flurry of togas, surprise, and careful thrusts, the sound of steel in short arcs. Caesar tried to defend himself, Some say he saw Brutus and slackened. Some say he saw only where the old republic had trusted him. When Brutus lifted his hand, the last possibility of pardon died under the flattened light of that hall. They struck him with so many blades that the ground drank his blood. The great general, the reformer, the man who had bent the Mediterranean to Rome's will, fell where the republic's laws were supposed to reign. When the knives were done, the conspirators stood trembling and looked at their work as if it might burn. For a moment they believed they had done the right thing. They stepped from the theater into sunlight and the cool columns of the Forum. They expected to be hailed as saviors. Instead, when news spread, the city heard a different sound, a rising moan that would turn to fury. Mark Antony recognized danger first. He departed for Caesar's house under the pretext of mourning, his mind already weaving words. He took Caesar's body, and with Caesar's will in his pocket, an act that would prove shrewd, he called for a public funeral. The conspirators stood on the rostrum, declaring their deed the resurrection of liberty. Cicero spoke of law and cautious reform. For an earnest, panicked hour the world held its breath. Antony's speech came like a spark in wind. He clasped Caesar's mantle and let the city see the wounds. He spoke of Caesar's deeds in a voice that did not aim to inflame with falsehood, but to show the man to the people. Then he did what no one had expected. He read Caesar's will, item by tender item, revealing legacies to the citizens, money, and, finally, the name of the heir, Gaius Octavius, a young man not yet 20, Caesar's adopted son. As Antony's words wound the crowd, the mood changed. Sorrow curdled into outrage. The masses, who had known Caesar as patron and benefactor, saw their own losses and hopes in the will and in the body laid before them. The conspirators, men who had counted on the respect of the elites, were suddenly alone in a city that found a new cause, a murdered leader and the promise of recompense. Rioters dragged the conspirators from the streets. Statues toppled, houses were sacked. The murder had been meant to be an antiseptic operation, a surgical strike to restore law, but instead it revealed the Republic's true weakness. In Rome, power had already passed into the hands of generals and legions, and into the hearts of men whom a robe could not command. Cassius and Brutus fled to the eastern provinces, gathering forces among those who still clung to the old ideals, and among those who hated Antony's decisive grasp on Caesar's mantle. Antony, whose gifts in oratory were matched by a talent for political savagery, allied with Octavian and Lepidus, forming the second triumvirate. Their first acts were not speeches but lists, proscriptions that hunted enemies and took property. The line between justice and vengeance blurred into a legal bloodletting. Civil war uncoiled across the Mediterranean. Armies met at Philippi in Macedon, one last great collision between a dream of shared rule and the hard reality of power concentrated in a few hands. The fighting was fierce and formal, legions in tidy ranks, standards raised, trombones calling. Cassius, misreading the battlefield's omen, took his own life when he thought all was lost. Brutus, who had kept the flame of the old republic alive in his chest, fought with the stubborn clarity of a man who preferred death to a hollow peace. He too chose his own end on a field that would be a mass grave for the illusion of Rome as it had been. With the conspirators gone, the triumvirs divided the spoils. The republic's institutions remained in name, senate, magistracies, assemblies, but their teeth were removed. Power now flowed from men who commanded armies and could grant peace and land with a decree. The triumvirate itself broke apart as ambition outgrew alliance. Antony's love and politics pulled him to the east. Octavian, young and patient, consolidated power in Rome. At Actium, on a sea glittering with ships and fire, Octavian faced Antony and the Queen of Egypt. The battle was not only of arms but of narrative. Which Rome would survive, the one that bent to a single ruler from the city, or the one intoxicated by Eastern wealth and monarchy. Antony's defeat was final. His death beside Cleopatra closed a chapter of civil war and left Octavian as undisputed master. Yet Octavian did not wear the crown of a tyrant. He moved with a careful hand, restoring the Senate's ceremonies, sending home legions, and framing his rule as a restoration. He took the name Augustus and set about remaking Rome not by law alone, but by building, by spectacles, and by the slow accretion of authority that the Republic's founders had never imagined. The old days of collective rule were not ended with fanfare, but by the quieter, more terrible process of reassigning the means of decision to one man and his successors. In the twilight of his life, Brutus's idea that the murder would save the Republic seemed as distant as a dream. Men recited his name with pity, and poets mourned the Republic's corpse on marble steps. Statues were raised to Caesar's memory in a city that had been both grateful and terrified of him. Where senators had once debated loudly and often, they now consulted a prince who steered the ship with a steady hand. What began as a bid to throw down a would-be king had become the end of the polity that allowed for such a thing. The knives removed a man, but not the structures that had made one man king both feared and welcomed. Rome did not end with the last blow at the theater. It changed with the slow acceptance that the Republic's habits and needs required a single, steady authority. Centuries would remember the Ides of March as the moment a tyrant fell. They would not forget that the Republic had been dying well before that day, worn by wars, debt, and the very victories that had made Caesar great. The conspirators acted out of love of an ideal that no longer fit the world they governed. In trying to resurrect a lost past, they hastened an irrevocable future. The city they sought to save became the cradle of a different order, one that would rule the Mediterranean for generations, an empire born from an assassination intended to preserve liberty.